This is Michael Wong. I'm the Vice President of the San Francisco chapter of Veterans for Peace, as well as one of the two co-chairs of the Veterans for Peace China Working Group, and a co-founder of the organization Pivot to Peace, which is a coalition of the peace community and the Chinese community. We're here today with Ray McGovern, who's a retired CIA analyst. He worked at the highest levels doing the presidential briefings each day for two presidents, I believe it was George Herbert Bush and Bill Clinton. Is that correct?
There were three, actually. It
Oh,
started with Nixon, but the only ones that I saw in person, one-on-one, with these briefings were under Ronald Reagan. And even then, since he preferred to sleep in, I saw his chief advisors, the Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and two others. So, yeah, it was Reagan, in which I had that privilege of being one-on-one. The other two, we completed our masterful prose, sent it down, and Henry Kissinger would show it to the president or not show it to the president, depending on what Kissinger wanted the president to know. And it wasn't always the factual thing that he wanted the president to know. So we had direct access under Ronald Reagan. We had indirect access, the courier bringing our printed version through Kissinger to Nixon and let's see who else, and Ford.
oh, okay. So I stand corrected. And then in the run-up to the Iraq War, you, I believe, were already retired, and then came out as a peace activist, joined Veterans for Peace, and as one of our prominent advisors. And you also started an organization called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which is a great organization. And I know you just issued a letter to President Biden talking about the problems with intelligence and accurate intelligence reaching the president. And it's signed by a number of your members who have very prominent and impressive credentials. So I'd like you to read that letter and also read the list of names and their credentials at the end, which I found very impressive.
Okay. First, let me just set the stage by saying that the reason we formed our group was that we saw that our fundamental intelligence analysis code had been broken by our former colleagues. When you have former colleagues with whom you work, some of them good friends, deliberately distorting, deliberately manufacturing evidence to justify a war of aggression, well, doesn't get any worse than that. So there were a core at first of about five of us that got together and said, we need to find some way to communicate with the president, even though we're sort of not on active duty anymore. And so we did that in January of 2003. And in February of 2003, when Colin Powell got up and misled the UN Security Council with that famous or infamous speech, we wrote our first memorandum pointing out that the performance was A, the content was C minus. We pointed out the holes in the evidence, and we finished up with a sentence or a paragraph, one sentence that said, we strongly advise you, Mr. Bush, to widen the circle of your advisors beyond those clearly bent on a war for which we see no cogent reason and from which we believe the unanticipated consequences are likely to be catastrophic, period, end quote. Well, that was about, 6-7 weeks before the war. No one paid us any heed. The fact that we were right and talking about the catastrophic, that doesn't give us any pleasure. when we're right, would like to be listened to. So, suffice it to say, this most recent letter was composed exactly a week ago. We wanted to warn President Biden that as he talked to Secretary of Defense Austin, before Austin went off to Ramstein in Germany to talk to counterparts about how much more weaponry, how much more sophisticated did the weaponry need to be with respect to the war in Ukraine. How much more should we give them? We wanted to brace him and say, look, there's probably a gentle way to say this, but bottom line is that defense secretaries lie, secretaries of state lie, national security advisors lie. It's axiomatic that when there's a war on, the first casualty is the truth. So if Austin gives you a bill of goods here and says that Ukraine can win this easily, kick the tires. For you younger people who don't realize what it was for us old guys to buy used cars or even new cars, we kicked the tires. The tires were a very important part of that car, right? And sometimes they caved in. So kick the tires. I'll start reading the rest of it, and I hope you'll get the notion that what we were trying to tell Biden is, look, don't believe everything that your sophomoric advisors like Tony Blinken, what's his name, Jake Sullivan, and Austin tell you, because the record is not really good, nor is the record of previous defense secretaries very good. And the one benefit that we have from having this kind of hair and going back a couple of decades or more is that we've seen it before. And we can speak out of our experience. It was not experience that we read in history books, but experience we went through, experience where we lost a lot of good friends, Vietnam and elsewhere. So maybe I would just start with that. And I have a fancy way of putting this text up in front of me. That'll work. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So it was September 5th. What's today? The 11th? So 6 days ago. We construct these memos, memorandum for the president from VIPS. Okay. The subject was denouement on Ukraine. Mr. President, before Defense Secretary Austin flies off to Ramstein for the meeting Thursday of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, we owe you a few words of caution, occasioned by our many decades of experience with what happens to intelligence in wartime. If he tells you Kiev is beating back the Russians, kick the tires and consider widening your circle of advisors. Going back to our very first memo, where that's what we suggested George W. Bush do. We had to assume at the time he was not quite aware of the chicanery that was going on with intelligence. We know now it was part and parcel of it. To continue, truth is the coin of the realm in intelligence analysis. It is equally axiomatic that truth is the first casualty of war, and that applies to the war in Ukraine as well as earlier wars that we've been involved in. When at war, defense secretaries, secretaries of state, and generals simply cannot be relied upon to tell the truth to the media or even to you, the president. We learned that early. We learned that the hard and bitter way. A lot of our comrades in arms did not come back from Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson preferred to believe General William Westmoreland, the chief of the general that ordered our folks there in Vietnam. General William Westmoreland, who told him and Defense Secretary McNamara in 1967 that South Vietnam could win If only Lyndon Johnson supplied an additional 260,000 troops. CIA analysts knew that to be untrue, and that worse still, Westmoreland was deliberately falsifying the number of forces he faced, claiming there were only 299,000. 299. That's like buying a camera for $39.99, right? Only there couldn't be more than 299,000 Vietnamese communists under arms in South Vietnam. We reported, after extensive work, that the number was 500 to 600,000. Sadly, we were proven right during the countrywide communist Tet Offensive in early 1968. And Johnson, as you'll recall, quickly decided not to run for another term. All being fair in love and war, the generals in Saigon were determined to offer a rosy picture. And in August 20, 1967, cable from Saigon, Westmoreland's deputy, General Creighton Abrams, explained the rationale for their common deception. He wrote that the higher enemy numbers, which were supported by virtually all intelligence agencies, all but the Army for obvious reasons, the higher enemy numbers, quote, were in sharp contrast to the current overall strength figure, about 299,000, that we were giving to the press, end quote. Abrams continued, quote, "We have been projecting an image of success over recent months." And then he cautioned that if the higher figures became public, quote, "all available caveats and explanations will not prevent the press from drawing an erroneous and gloomy conclusion, period," end quote. Now, General Abrams, parenthetically, was a terrific tanker during World War II. Patton said he was one of the best, okay? Wasn't really smart politically by committing this to paper. Here it was in a cable from Saigon. We can't tell the truth because then the press would be prompted to give an erroneous and gloomy conclusion. Erroneous only because it contradicts our falsified figures. End of aside. There's a very sad tale that I have to tell about imagery analysis. Now, this started out, of course, with imagery taken from planes and from U-2s when the technology permitted. U-2s were really long-armed planes that would fly over and take photos, and then would dump the load down into the ocean, try to catch it, take it back to Rochester, develop it, find out what was going on. A hiatus of about 3 or 4 weeks. Then, of course, under Cuba, that is, we're talking now 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's when we came into our own. We're able to fly a U-2 over Cuba and determine almost immediately that there were bad missiles there. I'll continue. Until 1996, CIA had an independent capability to do unencumbered military analysis, enabling it to speak the truth, even during war. I can attest to that. I was there, been there, done that. Continuing. One key arrow in the analysis quiver was its established responsibility to perform imagery analysis for the entire intelligence community. This was the role of the Central Intelligence Agency. Get the community together, but then don't let one element tell its own tale. Work it out and get a considered judgment that was neither justifying war nor justifying a foreign policy, as would be the case with the State Department. So the early success in pinpointing Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962 had earned what was called the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, is what we called it, had earned a solid reputation for professionalism and objectivity. Again, it was not under the State Department. It was not under the Defense Department. It was independent, as CIA was supposed to be in its intelligence analysis. Okay. Now, NPIC helped considerably in our analysis of the Vietnam War, and later it played a key role in assessing Soviet strategic capabilities and in verifying arms control agreements. Parenthetically, I had the honor of participating in the development of the Treaty on Anti-Ballistic Missiles, signed in Moscow in May 1972. I was there. Kissinger and Nixon asked us, can you verify? Are the Russians going to cheat? And we said, well, if they cheat, we can verify. And they said, well, how quickly? We went back to the engineers and the technical people, get back with the answer, about 10 days. Okay, if you could verify within 10 days, that's good. Upshot of that, did the Soviets cheat? Yes, they cheated. Did we find it? Yes, we did. 1983, they built this monstrous ABM facility in a place called Krasnoyarsk in the middle of Siberia. We found it. We took photos of it. We gave them to the Russians and said, you cheated. That was under Ronald Reagan. Well, it took 6 years. Finally, Gorbachev admitted, okay, we cheated. We're going to tear that thing down. And they did. So the value of an independent agency in the US government to evaluate intelligence on such incredibly important things like whether the Russians were violating the ABM treaty or whether they were, what they were doing with respect to Vietnam or earlier Cuba. And that was a sacrosanct part. Hang on for a second. That was an integral part of the Central Intelligence Agency under its community function at the time, under the Director of Central Intelligence. So what happened? Well, in 1996, when NPIC, the National Photographic Intelligence Center, and its 800 highly professional imagery analysts were given kit and caboodle, lock, stock, and barrel to the Pentagon, it was goodbye to impartial intelligence. In other words, if the Pentagon controlled the interpretation, if it controlled the analysis of imagery intelligence, well, the Pentagon's going to tell the president what the Pentagon wants the president to know, not what an objective super organization over all intelligence agencies would tell the president is the truth. So what happened? Well, here's an example. It has to do with Iraq. I'll continue reading. Retired Air Force General James Clapper, parenthetically, whom you may remember was the Director of National Intelligence under Obama and was not fired even after he perjured himself under oath before the Senate Intelligence Committee, parenthesis closed. Air Force General James Clapper was given the imagery analysts and put in charge of NPIC's successor. They called that new organization the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, NEMA. And so Clapper was well positioned and did well positioned to grease the skids for a war of choice on Iraq. Indeed, I continue reading. Now, Clapper is one of the few senior officials to admit that under pressure from Vice President Cheney, and he says this in his book, he was, quote, leaning forward to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He could find none, but he went along anyway. Now get this, I continue. In Clapper's memoir, he accepts part of the blame for this consequential fraud. He calls it the failure in the quest to find the non-existent weapons of mass destruction. He writes, and get this now, and this is in our text, he writes, we were so eager to help that we found what really wasn't there. I repeat that. We were so eager to help under the pressure from Vice President Cheney that we found what wasn't really there. Strange admission. I called him on that. This is a parenthesis, of course. I called him on that in November of 2017. And they say, oh, blah, 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 blah. And everybody at the Carnegie Institute looked at me like I had horns because I challenged this perjurer. Anyhow, the next little case study, if you will use the Harvard Business School jargon, is about Afghanistan. Quote, a quote from our memo. You will recall the extreme pressure on President Obama coming from Defense Secretary Gates, Secretary of State Clinton, and generals like Petraeus and McChrystal to double down in sending more troops to Afghanistan. They were able to push aside intelligence community analysts like the ones from the CIA and the State Department and the Defense Intelligence Agency. They pushed them aside, relegating them to strap hangers at decision-making meetings. We recall U.S. Ambassador in Kabul, Carl Eikenberry, a former Army Lieutenant General who had commanded the troops in Afghanistan. He appealed plaintively for an objective national intelligence estimate. That was the coin of the realm. That was what people looked at in terms of what the intelligence community expected. He couldn't get one. He couldn't get a national intelligence estimate. Petraeus and Gates, the defense secretary, were running the show. They knew what was best. They didn't need any independent intelligence input. Back to the text here. We are aware, Mr. Biden, we are aware of reports that you demurred on Afghanistan, sensing that deepening U.S. involvement would be a fool's errand. Remember when General McChrystal promised in February of 2010 a government in a box ready to roll into the key Afghan city of Marja? We thought Biden would remember that. This is one of the more ludicrous claims by our commanders in Afghanistan. McChrystal saying, we have government in a box ready to roll right into Marja, a major city, a key city in Afghanistan. It never showed up. Anyhow, I continue. The president, as you well know, President Obama in those days, deferred to Gates, defense secretary, and to the generals, McChrystal Petraeus, some of the others. And last summer, it was left to you, Mr. Biden, to pick up the pieces of Afghanistan. As for the fiasco in Iraq, the surge in 2007 that Gates and Petraeus were picked by Cheney to implement brought almost 1,000 additional transfer cases. We used to call them coffins to Dover Air Force Base, while allowing Bush and Cheney to go west without having lost a war. That was one of the more despicable things. Gates himself had joined a group saying, makes no sense to double down in Iraq at this point. And yet when they offered him, you could become Secretary of Defense, he changed his mind and said, oh, yeah, whoa, okay, let's go. David Petraeus, you're going to do it for me. And of course, we know the answer. The answer in terms of transfer cases was an additional 1,000 U.S. people killed in that surge. I go back to the original here. As for former Defense Secretary Gates's undented Teflon coat, after his double down advice on Iraq and Afghanistan, he had the chutzpah, he had the gall to include in the following a speech. He included the following in a speech at West Point on February 25, 2011, shortly before Gates, left office. Here's the quote from Gates. Now remember the background, what he did with respect to Iraq and Afghanistan, the advice that he gave. Here he goes. At West Point, just 3 months before he retires. Quote, in my opinion, any future defense secretary who advises the president again to send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should, quote, have his head examined, end quote, as General Douglas MacArthur so delicately put it, end quote from Gates. I won't say anything more. There's another example we had used here, Syria. And we thought we ought to adduce this because we know that Austin's record on cooking intelligence is something that Biden really should know about, and probably no one told him. So here's what we said. Austin's reputation is not without blemish. Closer to home, Secretary Austin is no stranger to accusations of politicizing intelligence. He was commander of CENTCOM, the central command that has purview over places like Afghanistan and Iraq. He was commander of CENTCOM 2013 to 2016, when more than 50 CENTCOM military analysts in August 2015 signed a formal complaint to the Pentagon Inspector General that their intelligence reports on the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria were being inappropriately manipulated by the top brass. That's the cardinal sin in intelligence analysis. I continue. The analysts claim their reports are being changed by higher-ups to dovetail with the administration's public line that the U.S. was winning the battle against ISIS and against the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria. So what happened? The IG took up the investigation, Pentagon IG, and in February 2017, right after Austin had left, the Pentagon Inspector General found that allegations of intelligence being intentionally altered, delayed, or suppressed by top CENTCOM officials from mid-2014 to mid-2015 were, quote, largely unsubstantiated, period, end quote. Huh. largely unsubstantiated. Sounds like a whitewash to me. I continue. Well, we summarized the above by saying, in summary, Mr. President, we hope you will take the time to review this history and take it into account before sending Secretary Austin off to Ramstein. In addition, today's announcement, that is 6 days ago, that Russia intends to cut off gas through Nord Stream 1 until Western sanctions are removed, that's likely to have a significant impact on Austin's interlocutors in Ramstein. It may even be that European government leaders would be more inclined to carve out some sort of compromise before Russian forces advance farther and winter arrives. We hope you have been adequately briefed on the likely outcome of the recent Ukrainian offensive. Last sentence. You may also wish to seek counsel from CIA Director William Burns and others with experience in the history of Europe, and particularly of Germany. Media reports suggested earlier that in Ramstein, Austin would commit to providing Ukraine with still more weaponry and encourage his colleagues to do the same. If he follows the script, they may find fewer takers, particularly among those most vulnerable to the winter cold. And we finished up by listing the folks that signed this. There were 19 altogether. I'll mention several of them. William Binney, who is he was a technical chief out there in Fort Meade, an NSA, a technical director for world geopolitical and military analysis. He actually co-founded NSA Signals Intelligence Automation Research Center. He retired and joined Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, I think because he found we had more integrity than NSA. Here's Bogdan Zakovich. He was a team leader of the Federal Air Marshals and the Red Team. They used to go into US airports and US airplanes to see if they were vulnerable to hijacking before, and today is the anniversary, before 9/11. They were warned off, don't do this, it's too easy to penetrate, and we don't want to embarrass the airlines. Zakovich was appalled, and so were his comrades. Phil Giraldi, CIA operations officer. Matthew Ho, former captain, U.S. Marine Corps, Iraq and Foreign Service officer, Afghanistan, who quit when he saw that the U.S. was giving bad advice to the ambassador in Afghanistan, and Matthew would not be any part of prolonging that godforsaken war. Larry Johnson, former CIA intelligence officer and also former State Department counterintelligence official. John Kiriakou, former CIA counterintelligence officer, counterterrorism officer, I should say, and also a former senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Karen Katowski, former Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force. She was in the office of the Secretary of Defense during the planning with Israel for the attack on Iraq. She watched the manufacture of lies justifying the attack on Iraq close up from 2001 to 2003. Here are a few more. Ed Loomis, also a former technical director out at NSA. Myself, we call me a former U.S. Army infantry intelligence officer, which I was, and the CIA analyst, CIA briefer, CIA presidential briefer. Elizabeth Murray, former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East, National Intelligence Council, and a CIA political analyst. Todd Pierce, a major in U.S. Army Judge Advocate. Scott Ritter, former major, U.S. Marine Corps, former UN Inspector General, Iraq. Colleen Rowley, FBI Special Agent and former Minneapolis Division Legal Counsel. Her folks found out about 9/11 beforehand, but they were not allowed to get past the front office of the FBI in Washington. Ian Wright, Colonel U.S. Army, retired Foreign Service officer, resigned, one of 3 Foreign Service officers who resigned in protest of the war on Iraq. I'm sad to say, not one U.S. intelligence officer resigned, despite what they knew was going on. Only one Commonwealth community officer resigned, and he is now head of one of the Senate panels in Australia. I forgot one that we didn't have in this list at the beginning. Graham Fuller was the vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council, and that's as high up as you can go in the intelligence community. So this just by way of saying that here was a grab bag of people that were notified by email that we were doing this memo and chipped in and said, yeah, I want to sign on, added this, subtracted that, and within a weekend, namely by 6 September, we had this memo. Now, did Biden pay any heed to it? Well, I don't think so. Apparently, Austin went out there and doubled down, just as we warned Biden that he was likely to do. Now, we also talked about kicking the tires. There is great jubilation on the front page of the New York Times today that Ukraine may have turned the tide here. I thought they were winning before. Well, I guess they weren't winning. Or maybe they were, but they turned the tide again, okay? And they had this major offensive going against Russian forces up in the east, or the north part of the east. Now, is that true? Well, the specialists differ. The specialists that I trust suggest that this is really part of a Russian operation to have these people come in on an axis where they can be destroyed before they get out. In any case, it's going to take a long time because, well, the short answer is that this is an existential threat to Russia. Putin has said that. He said that often, ever since the coup in Kiev that was underwritten by Victoria Nuland and other Western states people on February 22nd, 2014. He says this is a direct threat to our national security. When he saw so-called anti-ballistic missile sites going up in Romania, where they're already established, Poland, where they're nearing completion, and he fearing also in Ukraine. Well, he said late last year that this would only give me 7 to 9 minutes, or if they're hypersonic missiles, will only be 5 to 7 minutes to decide whether I need to blow up the rest of the world. I mean, those were not exactly his words, but if you were Mr. Putin, would you want medium range, whether they're cruise missiles or hypersonic missiles, in place right on your border in Ukraine that could destroy your retaliatory ICBM force, that could destroy Moscow? Would you want to only have 5 to 9 minutes to decide whether this was the real deal and launch the rest of them out? No, you don't need that. And so the only thing he really kind of came down on after making proposals late last year that involved respecting his concerns, respecting Russia's concern with respect to the near abroad here. When that didn't work out, we know what he did. So, bottom line here is, was it unprovoked? Well, let me just add something that may help you understand. When Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, in 1962, put medium range and smaller range ballistic missiles in Cuba, despite our protestations that he should not do that. Kennedy, John Kennedy, the president's responsible for getting into all this stuff, President Kennedy threatened thermonuclear war. Now, did I or anyone else accuse Kennedy of doing this unprovoked? Come on, it was provoked because Khrushchev did exactly what Kennedy and all of Congress, everybody else, told him not to do. How close did we come to the end of the world, or the end of most of the world at that time? Well, I tell you, just yeah, right. I'll tell you just a very short vignette here. I had been commissioned on graduation in the U.S. Army Intelligence. They put off my call to duty to finish a master's degree. And I was to report on active duty at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Army Infantry School, on the 3rd of November, 1962. I showed up. I was all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I wanted to train on the newest weapons like a rocket launcher and things like that. And guess what? There were no weapons at the U.S. Army Infantry School. We thought that was a little bizarre, right? So finally, we got up our courage. We asked one of the sergeants. They said, "Hey, Sarge, where are the weapons?" And he said, "Oh, 2 divisions came through here 2 weeks ago, took all our weapons. They're down in Key West now. They're going into Cuba if things don't calm down." Hello. That's how close we were. We'll get back to the point here. That was provoked, right? And nobody accused Kennedy of overreacting. Now, let's go back to Ukraine. We have those missile emplacements already in Romania, in Poland, almost completed. What Putin didn't want is have them go into Ukraine as well, and maybe even Crimea earlier on. And so he tried to talk reason to people like Blinken. And Blinken said, no, we don't go with the spheres of influence anymore. No, that's passe. Hello. And so last thing I'll say, and it's probably the most important thing, is that in my view, Putin got Chinese approval for doing something that the Chinese have always been very principled against, and that is invading another country. On the 4th of February this year, Putin went up to Beijing to have a summit with Xi Jinping. And in my view, he told him, look, we're not being taken seriously by the Americans. We're gonna have to clean Ukraine out, make sure they don't put missiles in Ukraine, and do what we can to destroy the Nazis there. What do you think, Xi Jinping? My notion is, of course, I wasn't there, but it seems to me that what Xi Jinping responded was, you mean after the Olympics, right? After the Olympics are over? Well, the day after the Olympics were over, Russia recognized Donetsk and Lugansk as separate independent states. 2 days later, they went into Ukraine. The reason I mention that is because these two are going to meet again Thursday and Friday this week in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. They haven't met since February 4th. And what they say to each other and whatever commitments they make to each other are going to be more important than what happens on the ground in Ukraine. My opinion is that the Soviets, the Soviets, the Russians can't afford to lose in Ukraine. It's an existential matter for them. They're not going to lose. And I think before they resort to tactical nuclear weapons, they'll resort to Xi Jinping and say, "Hey, can you dust up some activity out there in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait to make sure that the Americans know that they could just face a two-front war out of all this."
We have
I've
7 minutes
carried on
left.
longer than I wanted to. Sure. Well, yeah.
Let me make a
Should I
comment.
start? Should Sure, please.
Okay, I just want to go back to the subject of uh, inaccurate intelligence and relate it to China because that's significant. Uh, Recently, Lieutenant General Samuel Hit Clinton uh, Hino said, quote, "We are going to make it very difficult to maneuver aggressively against our friends, and I hope our adversary China can think about it if they see difficulty in crossing the 90-mile strait and fighting Taiwan." The reason that's significant is this is standard misinformation by a lieutenant general in the US Air Force, and it reinforces exactly everything you've said about the inaccurate intelligence that has been given to the president. Yes, there's a 90-mile strait between the mainland and Taiwan Island. But if the United States wanted to send reinforcements or engage the Chinese Navy in any way, our bases are in Japan and Guam. Those are our nearest bases. Japan's over 1,000 miles away. Guam is over 2,000 miles away. So if a lieutenant general in the US Air Force is saying that Xi Jinping should think about a 90-mile strait, we should think about 1,000 miles and 2,000 miles for us to send reinforcements. So I think this is typical of the kind of misinformation that gets put out by the intelligence community, just like all the examples that you said. In terms of, you know, what Putin may have shared with Xi Jinping prior to the war in Ukraine, I don't know. It's speculation, uh, and I don't have access to any confidential sources, so I wouldn't uh, try to say what was said or unsaid. In terms of what China might do, first of all, I don't think Russia's likely to lose. I agree with you on that point. So probably this question will never arise. But if it should arise for some reason as to what Putin might ask for if he decides that he needs more support from China, what China did when Pelosi visited Taiwan was rather than engaging the US military in a shooting war, which he had every opportunity to do at that point, what he did was he surrounded Taiwan with 6 different uh, live fire exercises by the Chinese Navy, which basically demonstrated that they have the ability, if they wanted to cut off Taiwan by sea and block us. And we had the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier task force out there to kind of support Nancy's visit. That task force turned around and ran. So that means that China has already demonstrated its force and its strength close to its shores. And if China were asked to create some kind of distraction, they actually wouldn't have to start a shooting war. They could simply do exercises, demonstrate their strength, and create a distraction that way. Now, whether they would ever need to do it and whether they would want to do it, I don't know. That's speculation. I don't have access to, of course, any classified sources. So, what's the relationship? What would they do? I don't know. I want to bring up another example, though, of bad intelligence, or not bad intelligence, but good intelligence that never got followed by the politicians in Washington. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA, at the end of World War II, they and the US State Department predicted that there would be a civil war between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists, and that the Chinese communists were likely to win. Since we had supported and worked with both against Japan during World War II, we were friends with both. And both the State Department and the OSS recommended that we simply stay neutral, remain friends with both, say, look, this is an issue between Chinese and Chinese. We will work with whatever government is the government in China. We didn't do that. The result was eventually we had the Korean War, which ended in a stalemate. The OSS also said the same thing about France and Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists, that we'd worked with both sides during World War II. We were friends with both sides. We should leave that as an issue between the two of them. And when the French lost, we should just continue our relationship with the Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists. We didn't do that. As you know, we went and basically occupied Vietnam, started a whole new war, and lost the war. So had good intelligence been listened to, we could have avoided the Korean War, we could have avoided the Vietnam War. And what happened to those officers was many of them were pushed out of service and their careers ruined. And that creates a disincentive for intelligence professionals now to come forward and tell the truth when they know the truth is not what the bosses in Washington want to hear. And I think that's important for people to know is going on.
That's really a point well making. I think I'm a little bit older than you, and the notion that communists could win anywhere, whether it was in China or whether it was in Vietnam, was just unacceptable in political terms. So you had a thick rhetoric where communists could not be allowed to win, or else the world would be occupied and controlled by them. Okay, that's how idiotic it was. In China, of course, as in Vietnam, you had nationalist forces who wanted to throw out colonial regimes or colonial powers that had exploited them in the past. So now we know that. And yet we have this fetish about Russians. Used to be communists, now it's Russians. They can't be allowed to win. And as the midterm elections come forward, I dare say it's going to be really, really hard to face into the fact that, look, you, the American people, have been sold a bill of goods about the Russians that ain't true. And I'll go back to a famous American humorist who said, and I quote, "The problem is not that people believe things that ain't so, it's that they ain't so and they still believe them." So 90% of the American people have been brainwashed, frankly, on the Russiagate and elsewhere for 5 years now to believe that Putin is the incarnate devil and that Russians can't be trusted. And so you have Ukraine as the bellwether as to whether Russians have replaced all communists of 50 years ago. They have pretty much. That's what we have to kind of guard against. May I have one other thing because it's very topical. Do we have time?
Yes, we have, we're actually over time, but the recording hasn't stopped. So
Okay. Well, if
go
I'm
ahead,
stopped,
just
I'm stopped.
finish up
It
as quickly as you can before we run out of time.
won't be the first time I'm stopped. Well, this is current. I was on a seminar yesterday yesterday. The question of how the Russians still give vocal approval, and so do the Chinese, to the UN. They say the UN is a body of laws that should be respected. They don't know about this. Was it a new code of conduct that the US is trying to? What was it? Not the values based, but what is it, Michael? The rules based. Yeah, the rules based order of international affairs. Well, yeah, that's great, except we make the rules, right? Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, what we have here is a situation in Zaporizhia, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, in Ukraine, being shelled. Now, the Russians complained about that very early on, tried to get the UN to send inspectors down. The inspectors came about 10 days ago. They had to be ushered in with a military escort from the Russians, for which the inspectors were very grateful and said so. They came in, inspected what was going on, left a skeleton force to stay there, and the shelling continues. Now, the UN IAEA, International Agency for Atomic, International Atomic Agency, IAEA, Rafael Grossi, he said at noon today, I am gravely concerned that as long as the shelling continues, we are in great peril. Oh, that's neat. Yeah. Nice to be gravely concerned. Who's doing the shelling? He can't say. So we're asked to believe that the Russians are shelling themselves at this nuclear power plant. Grossi was there. He saw that the shells were coming from across the river, and he can't say it. Nor can Common Dreams say it today. Common Dreams reporting Grossi's remark. My God, that's how bad it is. In other words, it doesn't make any sense for the Russians to be shelling this, but to suggest that the Ukrainians are, the UN itself can't do this, nor can Common Dreams, apparently. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that even though the Russians and the Chinese respect the UN and say we need to apply by its principles, they don't have any confidence in it. Why? Because the UN is controlled by the United States. Grossi will have no chance to be head of the IAEA without US approval. Neither will Gutierrez have a chance to be Secretary General. The UN is controlled by the US, Russia, China recognize that. They still say it's an awful lot better than the rules-based international system. So a system of law and order does exist. It's on paper, but it's controlled in such a way that not even the IAEA guru, Rafael Grossi, can go down there and say, my God, I saw them. I saw the shells coming in. They were coming from across the river in the Ukrainian side. He can't say that. And that speaks volumes. So this just by way of saying, my little, it became an answer to a Q&A question yesterday. And it's been all over Russia media today. It's been in Novosti and several, it was actually the live clip was shown on one of the main talk shows just this evening in Russia. So could I say that in the United States?
We'll
No,
find out
they
if
wouldn't
this
let me near
we'll find out
any
if this
video.
program gets censored or not.
Well, yeah, and we'll also find out if I'm not around for the next time you call me. Would you look into it, Michael?
Sure. And you do the
Thanks.
same for me.
I wish that were funny.
Yes. Well, we're both retired, so they can't ruin our careers at least. Although they did try to take Colonel Ann Wright's retirement away, and they failed at that. Right?
Yo,
I
I'm
lost
I'm
you for a
here.
minute. Say again?
Yeah. Well, I'm just here for a minute. I heard what you said about Ann Wright, and she's one of the best, of course. She's one of our VIPS folks and VFP folks, and there's none better. So we have to stick together, and the advice that I impart to people, if they need it or will listen to it, comes from a lawyer named Ferenc, a Hungarian Jew who became an officer in the U.S. Army and was one of the prosecutors at Nuremberg. He was the last to die, I think, just 3 years ago. And when he was asked for his advice, how do you carry on under these kinds of circumstances? You've seen the worst. You've seen the worst, Mr. Ferenc. How do you continue? I said, I'm glad you asked. I have 3 simple rules. Never give up. Never give up. And never give up. So you and I know, Michael, are not going to give up.
That's right. And that
I
sounds
hope
like an
that those
excellent note to end on.
I hope that people watching this similarly will not give up.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ray. We'll
You're most
talk
welcome.
again.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, Mike?
Okay, I'll stop recording.